talking about, I've been invited to talk about Daphne and the Daphne Project. I'm going to do my best to speak very slowly because it's not my forte. So if I go too fast, just let me know. So Monday, the 16th of October, 2017, so just over 3.5 years ago, journalist Daphne Galizia was sitting at her house in the countryside of Western Malta, working alongside her son, Matthew, who is also a prize-winning journalist. She had just uploaded technical issues. There's Matthew, and she had just uploaded a blog post on her personal blog. It was 2:35 in the afternoon, and it was quite a relatively short one compared to the usual. But it would become quite a well-known one because of the last sentence where she said, "There are crooks everywhere you look now, and the situation is desperate." She picked up some of her stuff and headed out to drive to a bank branch. She had been recently taken to court by the deputy leader of the governing party, who was also the Minister of the Economy, because in an explosive blog post earlier in the year, she had revealed that Mr. Cardona, the Deputy Prime Minister, had made his way to a brothel whilst on government business in Germany. He sued for libel and pressed for one of the most archaic and anti-democratic laws of the state. So the court was forced to execute 4 precautionary warrants, freezing Daphne's assets and basically leaving her bankrupt. That Monday afternoon, she had a bank appointment regarding this very issue, but we'll come back to that. Let's cover a bit of context first. The story that I'm about to say is a story that happened and is still happening in Malta. It's got many international implications and repercussions, and it serves as a good model for the harrowing stories of journalists harassed and bullied into giving up their inquisitive work. Moreover, Malta is not anymore an insignificant colonial outpost floating between Europe and Africa, but a European nation state recently chairing the biannual Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, as well as the presidency of the European Union. Malta has also been upgrading its impact on the politics of the region, particularly in Libya. It's a small country. It's a couple of islands. And the main island, the biggest one, is even smaller than the Victoria Line. So you can imagine how small it is. It is also one of the oldest places recording civilization in the world. It's got some of the finest architecture, a super rich history involving the Phoenicians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, the Knights of St. John's, the French, the British, and tangentially, we've got China, Libya, and North Korea. There he is, Kim Il-sung, who apparently shares my same alma mater. I was born there in the 1990s, where Malta was starting to embrace its European identity, making way for new technologies to start transforming the economy, joining the European Union, and eventually by 2008 joining the Eurozone. Following an almost continuous 25 years in government, the centre-right Nationalist Party, the same party which led Malta into the EU, lost by a massive landslide to the Labour Party, following several corruption scandals and internal fighting, something that is very common, I guess. The newly rebranded Labour Party, here we can see their supporters, is the same party which led Malta during the 80s and 90s, during the 70s and the 80s with fairly iron fist, and accompanied the introduction of very strong welfare state. We're aligning the country with some of the most questionable countries in the world, as you have seen. They claimed a huge victory thanks to 3 key figures which I'm going to ask you to remember a little bit about. Here we've got Joseph Muscat, who is a prime minister. He's been hailed as Malta's Tony Blair. You've got Keith Schembri, who is a relatively unknown businessman who led the campaign and became the chief of staff. And then an even more unknown figure, who no one kind of knew about, who was contesting for the election for the first time, who was called Conrad. And in a few days, he will be running some of Malta's biggest and most important ministerial offices. Within a few days of being in government, shell companies were set up in the secretive jurisdiction of Panama on the other side of the world. A new power station project was launched, led by Azerbaijan, another state on the other side of the world. And it was led by a consortium featuring this guy over here, Jorgen Fenek, who was Malta's top businessman. Remember him as well. A lot of other projects were launched, including a massive construction spree which took over the nation, and a passport scheme which has recently started making the headlines again. But back to Daphne. She was born in 1964, the same year Malta became independent. She was an avid reader and a very reserved person. She spent her youth protesting the anti-democratic rule of the Labour Party in the 1980s, and that landed her in jail whilst pregnant with her first child after protesting the forced closure of religious schools in Malta, and religious schools in Malta are a big thing. She was interrogated and forced to sign false statements by a superintendent who, surprise, is Malta's current Speaker of the House. The 1980s, as my parents will strongly talk about, were a time of crisis for the islands, where government ruling with a minority of votes, weekly ransacking of the opposition party clubs and independent press, gruesome murders and police-led violence. Here you can see the building of the Times of Malta being completely run over and burnt to the ground. Over the coming decade, in the 80s and 90s, Daphne took the pen and became Malta's first female columnist in the 90s. And she eventually became the associate editor. This was very new. It was very avant-garde concept for a woman to be working, let alone for a woman to have such an important position where her opinions kind of mattered and her opinions were printed on newspapers. So over these next 25 years, she'll be repeatedly intimidated for her work and opinions. Her front door was burnt down several times, especially set on fire in 1996. The family dog had its throat slit and was laid across her doorstep. And years later, her car was burned, possibly in a misdirected attack. There was a further incident in 2006 when the house was set on fire again while the family was asleep. And her terrier was poisoned, her collie was put down after being shot. It was a fairly nightmarish situation. And according to her son, Matthew, the threats were of a daily occurrence. It was like normal, it was normalized, basically, which is horrific. From phone calls to letters, to notes pinned to her front door, text messages, emails, and eventually comments on her blog. And then came March 2008, when she began a blog called Running Commentary, which included investigative reporting and commentary on current affairs and public figures. The blog was one of the most popular websites in Malta, and it attracted over 400,000 views a day. There are 400,000 people in Malta, so that's a massive number. And her blog was more popular than all the other newspapers combined. So 2013, the Labour Party is now in office, so she was super busy investigating and uncovering one scandal after the other. And it's also easy to forget that she was not doing this work as an employee of any newspaper, but by herself and on her own personal blog. Politico would go on to say that the best way to think of Daphne is as a one-woman WikiLeaks, crusading against untransparency and corruption in Malta, an island nation famous for both. Her major story, which will reach international waters, kicked off in February 2016 when she reported that Conrad Mizzi, that minister that I mentioned earlier, had connections with Panama and New Zealand. As you can see from this blog post, she had quite a nice sense of humor too, which made her reading, which made her blog post even more easy to read and great to follow. This compelled the minister to reveal the existence of a New Zealand registered trust, which she claimed was set up to manage his family assets. At the same time, she also revealed that the chief of staff owned a similar trust in New Zealand, which in turn held a Panama company. Then came April 2016. Some of you might remember Panama Leaks were launched. It was a combined effort by many newspapers around the world. And it confirmed that Mizzi owned the Panama company, and Mizzi and Schembri, here they are, had also started another company, and these companies were owned by a trust in New Zealand, the same trustees of Mizzi and Schembri's New Zealand trust. So it's all connected, it's all very complicated. If you're not familiar with financial speak, it took me forever to try and get my head around this. But as the first person to break news of Mizzi and Schembri's involvement in Panama, she was subsequently named by Politico again as one of the 28 people who are shaping and sparing Europe. Remember, most of these structures, here they are, it's all very hidden and all very interlinked, were set up within a few days of them becoming part of the government. So it's not something that they've set up before or at any other time. It was literally in the next few days when they entered office. Then came 2017, so a year later, and she led is that another company, which we didn't know much about, but we knew that existed, called eGrant. It's a very famous word in Malta now. Was owned by Michelle Muscat, who she is, wife of the Prime Minister Joseph Muscat. The information was reported to be stored in a safe, in a kitchen, in an infamous bank in Malta called Pilatus Bank, owned by Ali Sadeh Hazminejad, who was an Iranian bankman, who would be later be investigated by US prosecutors for circumventing Iranian sanctions. Here he is. Who will go on to threaten to sue all the media outlets in Malta. They all conceded and made changes to their reporting, except for one, and that is, of course, Daphne. Within 12 hours of her assassination, which we're going to talk about in a bit, in those 12 hours before, she had already been threatened by him and sued for $40 million in Arizona on the other side of the Atlantic. The Prime Minister claims the allegations against his wife were enough reason to call a general election in 2017, which happened literally like 2-3 days before the British one. And it returned him to power with an even larger majority. Caruana Galizia would importantly point out that the early election was not really because of her reporting, but it was planned before, and will kind of come down to the terms that probably this election was called because of another exposition that she was working on. But back to that fateful Monday afternoon of October 16, 2017, which I started with. So as she drove out of her house and made her way down, a bomb placed in her leased car took off and killed her instantly. Her body parts were found 80 meters away from the blast site. Matthew, her son, would later write, "I looked down and there were my body parts all around me." This was the 6th car bomb in Malta in less than 2 years. And think how small Malta is, that's huge. At the time of her death, Daphne was facing 48 libel suits. The outcry which followed her death was global, and the pressure on the government and the authorities to find the culprits was like no other. Magistrate after magistrate would go on to recuse themselves, either out of fear or of conflict of interest. But the involvement of Europol, the FBI, and other international police units made it hard for the murderers to go free for a long time. So in 3 months, these 3 men were arrested for carrying the assassination. We'll later find out that they knew they were going to be arrested through their connections with ministers and police officials. The whole operation was filmed. Here it is. And it looked like something out of a movie. It makes you wonder whether it was a big effort to improve the tarnished image of Malta internationally and give the impression that no stone is being left unturned. Out of the 3, only one of them has so far pleaded guilty, only after he was given a presidential pardon. It won't be until November 2019, so a few months before Corona hit, that the big cards will start to fall apart. Middleman Melvin Terma, here he is, with the Chief of Staff at the Prime Minister's office, was granted another presidential pardon to tell all. He implicated Jorgen, the guy who I mentioned earlier, as the mastermind, who in return would implicate Peach Cambry, here he is, with the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister. It's quite very tiring, isn't it? In the span of a few weeks, Cambry will resign and he will be questioned several times by the police. And Muscat, who was the Prime Minister, here he is at the very back in that little photograph, after forcing all his mates to vote in favor of him, so that he have a record of everyone being on his side, who would resign and make way for a new Prime Minister. I can go on and on here describing in detail the story of the past years, as Daphne's family had to take up the fight themselves to bring those responsible to face a very weak justice system. They had to take the government to international bodies such as the Council of Europe to force the country's hand into an independent public inquiry into what led to Daphne's murder. The revelations have been explosive at every turn, to the point of almost exhaustion. Against them, the family, at every corner, they found the Labour Party, the machines of the government and their supporters, went to claim that even Matthew, here he is, her son, out of jealousy for his mom's work, was responsible for her death. And they thought this was a um, plausible thing to say. But out of this came the Daphne Project and Daphne Caruana Pulitzer Foundation. They are both playing a role in keeping Daphne's legacy alive, either through supporting investigative work or by continuing her investigations for which she was murdered. The Daphne Project is made up of journalists from across the world's leading newsrooms: Guardian, the New York Times, Reuters, Süddeutsche Zeitung, La Repubblica, Times of Malta, and many others. In one of the most consequential investigations, they named Jorgen Tenek, the guy who's currently under arrest for being the mastermind, as the man behind another company in Dubai called 17 Black, which linked Maltese politicians and was first discovered by Daphne a few months before she was murdered. It was the major story Daphne was working on after she had received a huge leak of data from Electrogas, which is the group behind the new power station being built in Malta. And through ongoing investigations, it became apparent that this was the story for which Tenek wanted to get rid of Daphne and commissioned the murder, and also potentially why the election was called. So looking back to 2013 and comparing it to where we are now, Malta, a European nation state, super tiny, has got the following: a former prime minister who resigned for being close to the murder gang, a former chief of staff who was called to resign for being implicated in the murder, a former deputy prime minister implicated in the murder plot, a former energy minister who had, within a few hours of being in charge, set up hidden structures open to bribery and money laundering, a foreign affairs minister and a current minister implicated in a related bank heist, a recent junior minister implicated in an undeclared business and a romantic relationship with the mastermind of the murder, a former police chief implicated in being in cohorts with gang members linked to the murder, a former deputy police chief and husband of the Minister of Education who was close friends with the murder mastermind and allegedly passed information on to them, a former security guard of the Prime Minister passing on information to the middleman on behalf of the Chief of Staff, an accountancy firm with a desk at the Prime Minister's office arrested and delicensed for high-level money laundering and false documentation, a Speaker of the House who in his days arrested and harassed Daphne, and a new Prime Minister who has been threatening to shut down the public inquiry into Daphne's murder. The list goes on and on, all this within a country of a few miles. And the worrying thing is that the civil society group, activists, and journalists are still considered paid figures in Malta, with Daphne a controversial figure despite her being proven right over and over again and having paid for her work with her life. But this is, of course, not only a local problem. Organizations like Reporters Without Borders have been sounding the alarm about the increasingly dangerous conditions for journalists. Only in the last few weeks in Europe, Georgios Karavas, a Greek journalist uncovering the country's underworld, was shot and killed with 10 bullets to his head and chest. Only a few months ago, we had an American president rallying up huge crowds against journalists and newspapers. And I would like to finish this rather bleak talk on a more positive note. But in reality, the situation is still very volatile and desperate. So it's hard to put a positive twist to this. So my advice, support journalists, talk about the work and the stories, support the newspapers, even if you don't always see eye to eye with their editorial stance. Because they are one of the strongest pillars in our democracy, doing the work that we should all be doing, that is to keep those in charge accountable. And in a nutshell, subscribe to all these newspapers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Euchar. So now we have the opportunity, both online and in church, for any questions. Mark.
Two things. You mentioned an inquiry right at the end of your talk. Can you say a bit more about that, about how effective that's likely to be?
Yeah, so there was so the family, Daphne's family, has been calling for a public inquiry to kind of find why the state why the state created, why there was the environment ripe enough for her to be killed. And they had to fight and fight and fight for it. The government wouldn't budge at all. So the Council of Europe had to kind of release an ultimatum. And then the government invited the family in to figure out a way of doing that. So that started just before COVID. There was even panic on who's going to be on the inquiry, and it had to be changed because the family didn't agree. And it's been going for over a year now. And the Prime Minister had threatened many times to just shut it down. And it's been incredibly explosive because they have been calling people in and they had to answer questions on their oath. And it was through that lots of things have started to come out, and all the pictures started to come together. And this was also the time when all the main people involved, the masterminds, were being arrested as well. So it all kind of piled together. We don't know how effective this is going to be, in the sense that we have the details, but what's going to happen after that? The inquiry is still going on, so I can't really say much. But hopefully they will come up with a series of recommendations, I hope, that can be put in place. But it's very tiring because everything takes either a lot of time, which is of course completely fine in a way, but everything is fought against at every stage. And the government has been trying to shut it down because so many uncomfortable things came out through that.
Thank you. Pat?
Was there a sort of tradition of corruption in Malta before it went into the EU? Because I can imagine once you've got access to all the European funds, that's when, from what you were saying, I got the impression that's when all these offshore trusts.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that Malta abused lots of European funds. I would say Malta abused of its position as being an open door to Europe. So, for example, with the Golden Passport scheme, so many people, rich people from Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, and other places around the world have managed to buy a passport, a Maltese passport, which basically means you can get lost in Europe. Malta's even in the Schengen zone, so you don't even need to present your passport when moving between Schengen countries at normal times. And I think if you go around, you'll find that lots of rich people who have been doing business within European countries will have a Maltese passport or a Cypriot passport because it's a getaway, and it's like it gives you access to Europe. But yes, there is a culture of corruption in Malta, and I'm not sure where that comes from. Probably it's a mix of its history, being a small nation state, always kind of in a colonial situation where you're kind of seeking patronage, which is a big thing in Malta. And I think it's also very cultural in the sense that it's very normalized and it's a way of doing things. I think the problem is that it reached certain high levels of government which previously it wouldn't have, or there are new ways of doing things like secretly setting up companies in other jurisdictions, which if Panama Papers didn't happen, we wouldn't have known about, and we wouldn't have known about any of this stuff. So yeah, there is a culture that helped that, but it's gone wild in the last couple of years.
Thank you. Lindy?
It's about the elections. Do people vote for you? How come we keep getting reinstated these crooks?
Yeah, good question.
So for the people online, Lindy asked about the elections and basically whether some of those corrupt people might get back in.
Well, how do they get back in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've been asking that myself quite a lot, and it's easy to, it makes you lose heart. But I think it's a mix of lots of things. Again, Malta's got a very, culture of corruption is very normalized. So patronage is a big thing. You'll vote for whoever can protect you in a way. Who cares if that person might have had a shady deal I mean, all it takes is to go online, on social media, and you see when a corruption scandal comes out, or when we discover that a minister has the secret bank account, people go, oh, who cares? He reduced my energy bills. He built my road. Why would I care? I mean, he's working for it, so why not? And that is really scary. It's like, as long as he can get away with it, why not? It's a sign that he's using his brains, isn't it? And yeah, the Labour Party increased its majority after all this came out. Not to mention that the opposition party has been in disarray, and it's not even that it wasn't even in a fit state to govern in a way because of its internal fighting. But yeah, and it happens everywhere, doesn't it? I mean, it happens even in this country, if I may say so, where exactly, yeah, and then I'm not even going to go into questions of ideology because you might people have different ideas on that, but the idea of integrity, of having a candidate who's running and whose integrity is very questionable, and they still attract public opinion. I can't really tell much about it except for the fact that it really depresses me. And I'm sure there are reasons for it, but yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for this, Euchar. I want to bring the question back to Daphne, and I think this is really timely because, as we both know, last week was World Press Freedom Day.
It was a Monday, yes.
Yeah, and I think I like how you opened it up in the end to talk about the work of journalists to report without fear or favor. I mean, I was a journalist in Malaysia as well, and one of the first lessons I learned as an independent journalist was our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and to speak without fear or favor. And we get intimidated different ways in different countries. So in Malaysia, it's through lawsuits, imprisonment. But I spoke to a colleague from the Philippines. She said, oh, in the Philippines, they just shoot us and throw us into a ditch. Right? So, fact and degree. But I just wanted to ask you about the Daphne Project. What exactly is it calling for? Is it calling for us to support the inquiry? Is it calling us for us to support litigation, for funds? And how is it specific to Daphne, and how is it bigger? Because you said there are all these news organizations that have signed up to it, so including The Guardian in the UK.
So I think
for those online, Shannon's question very, very briefly was about the main aim and desire for achievement of the Daphne Project.
So the Daphne Project came about, I think it was quite an innovative project in a way. So it was when journalists came together and it's like, well, they killed the journalist for her work so that she doesn't publish the work. So what is a good way to keep her legacy alive? It's by taking whatever she was working on and make sure that it comes to fruition. So they worked for months, gathering all the information in her laptops, all the data that she had collected, and of course adding material to make sure that this story still comes to life, because that's why she was killed. And I think it's part of a series called Forbidden Stories. So all these newspapers and all these journalists from these newspapers are coming together every time that a prominent journalist is murdered, and they pick up their stories and try to continue that. I would say that I think the easiest kind of way for us to support their work is by basically reading it and acting on it, which I think is which is in itself almost becoming a challenge, in the sense that there are so many breaking stories all the time that people get inundated by all kinds of bad stories, and you get like, oh, just another one, it's fine, and that's how things start to slide when we stop being shocked and we stop being surprised by things. And I think that's the first step for us to help them, in a way, make the story count. It's the same way when you read a book. If no one reads it, no one is going to know about it. But if you read it and then you pass it on to someone else, and then you pass it on to someone else, people start to know about it. And I think that's the easiest kind of first step. The other step is to support the newsrooms. With little subscriptions every month, we can support so many of these newsrooms who are facing $1 million suits all the time. There are law firms out there whose sole purpose is to carry out these suits for millions and millions of pounds, dollars, wherever it is. So supporting these organizations financially is, of course, a great way. Another way is to go on Reporters Without Borders website and supporting their work. They do huge work, and they just opened the London Borough 2-3 years ago. They're currently working mostly on the Julian Assange case and other cases of journalists across Europe. So I would say those are the 3 basic things that we can do without much effort, in a way. So yeah.
Anyone else?
Sure.
Joanne?
First of all, thank you so much. It's great to hear you and that there is such a project. Like Shannon, I'm bringing it back to Daphne, and I'm wondering, with having to fight this network of evil to a certain extent, and having a life throughout your life, and bringing up a family, how did she manage to carry on? I mean, do you have any insight on that? Or
Well,
Okay, so for those of you online, Joelle's question was about Daphne herself, and obviously, as Euchar said, she had a family, she had children, and how did she carry on with life, basically, with those very conflicting things?
every article that I read or podcast by Matthew or Paul, who are 2 of her sons, they kind of make it sound like it was as if they had the most normal childhood, and she protected them so much from everything that was happening. Because I mean, these are children who walk into the house and find their dog killed in front of their door, or when I can't remember who turned up late at night and they found their house being burned with their mom and dad sleeping indoors. I think it's just character. She was one of a kind, really, from what I can gather, and it's just a question of perseverance that she kept on going. And I think she took everything to heart in the sense that she believed so much in what she was doing that for her was a normal part of her life. And she was harassed from very young age, and she was brought up in a very difficult time for Malta. So this was kind of, it was what she knew in a way. But yeah, I share your amazement, because, and I think most people in Malta share that she wasn't even working for a newspaper. She didn't have the backing of a newsroom. She was working by herself from her kitchen table on a block, which she ran by herself, whilst also having another job of doing magazines and running her house and bringing three men, bringing up 3 men, 3 kids. Yeah, I can't really tell much about that. It's just amazing what she managed to do.
I think we have time for a final question, if anybody has.
Presumably, I'm not sure I know much about Malta, but how strong is the church in Malta?
So that question was, how strong is the church in Malta?
Big question. It is fairly big.
So I cannot, I mean, I'm sitting here wondering why there isn't push by people in the church and the communities in the church to bring justice.
So why isn't the church doing it?
The church is doing something. The Archbishop, he's only been an Archbishop for a few years. I can't remember when he took over. Has been very vocal, and he led even her funeral, and he leads her memorials almost, I think, every year. And he's been very vocal about bringing people to justice, and he's been very vocal also in state mass Eucharists, which is a thing in Malta. To open the parliament, you have to have a Eucharist first, in his sermons to push that line. But it's also a bit tricky because the church is kind of, in a way, so big that, and it's got a long history of political entanglement that they kind of tread very carefully. So back in the 1960s, the Church of Malta excommunicated anyone who had voted for the Socialist Party. And that basically is a stain on the local history that still lives to this day. like my parents still remember it very clearly, and lots of people have like severed their relations with the church because of that, with the generations and grandchildren. It's still like, people talk about it still. So I think the church has been very careful in a way of not talking too much, or talking about things which maybe it feels it only the church can talk about. So more things about abortion, for example, or divorce, which was a big thing a couple of years ago. But yeah, I think the Archbishop himself, as a person, from what I can gather, has done his fair share of work. And I believe even the Pope had released a statement at the time of her murder.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your questions, and thank you all for being here, but most of all, thank you to you.
Thank you.